the event today is looking at our kind of first steps to COVID secure events, largely from hopefully a venue perspective, just to give a slightly different view than our previous events. I am Sarah Threlfall, so I'm from Brightspace Events, and historically my background is as an event director. So I have been working in, large corporate, large event management agencies on corporate style events, so meetings, conferences, incentive travel for 20 odd years. And I worked up to a head of events position within those areas. So, and all the way through that time, I was doing risk assessments for the events that I was leading on, and also received training in health and safety for events, as part of that role and as part of that experience. Then I left around 6 years ago and set up Brightspace Events. Largely just to serve the same clients. So I was assisting agencies who had too much business or not enough specialists or not enough kind of really experienced event directors in their teams, and was going in on a project by project basis and leading again generally on fairly large complex events. So again, more opportunity to experience and practice my risk assessments, but also to learn a wider industry, wider client list, wider agency list. So I've kind of really got a broad brush view of things, and particularly relevant to this session. I actually started right back in a kind of post-uni few years in venues. I didn't stay there very long, but I did have a bit of experience in a venue sales office for conferences. And of course, through the whole time that I've been an event director, then I've built up very close working relationships with venues. And I've done a few buyouts and things like that, where, I think you really do get under the skin of how it works in hotels and venues when you're looking at those kind of, big events or repeat events that are coming back year on year. So hopefully what I've got is a really good practical experience. And then this year I focused on changing that into a formal qualifications. So I've done lots of study and some certifications with IOSH. And I'm also just waiting for the final results for my NEBOSH qualification, which then qualifies me as a health and safety professional, outside of events. But yeah, so that's kind of my background, and that study and all of that formal learning that I've been doing this year means that I have, been able to combine that knowledge with the experience I've got as an event director, and kind of, then apply all of that to the COVID stuff. So I've got basically 10 tips. They sort of split down into a planning, assessment, and then implementation. So the very first thing we need to do is understand where we stand legally. I think that's kind of what everybody wants to know. And under the Health and Safety at Work Act, which hopefully we're all familiar with and has been around for a very long time, and therefore isn't going anywhere, we all have a legal duty to ensure the safety of our employees and people who are affected by our work. And then that extends further in the management of health and safety at work regulations, where it specifies that you have a duty to conduct a suitable and sufficient risk assessment of the hazards that are in your work. So that's all as it is. That hasn't changed. And relevant to this is that coronavirus is a hazard. HSE have classed it as a significant hazard. So it is something which everybody has a responsibility to assess and reduce risk under our existing health and safety law. So the key thing, I think, from a venue perspective, when you think about coronavirus as your hazard, is that the virus hazard is created by people. Without people, it's not a very high risk hazard, because eventually the virus will die and it can't transmit. So it's people that basically represent our risk here. And from your perspective, the biggest risk really is you could say that it's the fact that all these other people are coming into your venue and risking your staff. So if you kind of, you've got two angles really, but there's quite a significant argument for the fact that, the very fact that you're running an event and you've accepted the booking and all those sort of things means you've introduced a risk to your business, which is a huge number of people coming into your property. So you have a responsibility there. And because of that, it is important for you to be assessing your client, because they're the ones ultimately who are bringing these people in. So I go into this bit a little bit later, but so fundamentally, we all have a responsibility anyway in existing health and safety law. So that brings with it all the normal implications if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So if you don't do, if you don't reduce the risk, if you don't assess this hazard that is now in your workplace, you could be found to be in breach, which is a fine and possibly even a prosecution. Incredibly unlikely, but it's there as a possibility. The HSE are doing spot checks and they are, they're currently under scrutiny about the fact they're not making many fines or not doing any serious enforcement. So the worry now is that, of course, they could swing the other way and start to go a bit trigger happy with enforcement, but they are inspecting places and venues. And I think that when we do open up, events are going to be under the microscope. So if they came and said, where's your risk assessment for this event, and you didn't have anything to show them, potentially you could be in breach of the Health and Safety at Work Act and the regulations. So there's also a reputational risk in terms of outbreak, or even if people are at the event and don't feel safe. If people arrive and think, oh God, this is really badly organised. There's, I don't feel that I'm being protected. It's not making me feel great. They're going to go home and say, oh gosh, I went to an event at the Marriott down the road and it was awful. God, they had no one-way systems. There was no cleaning. It was just really awful. And so you've got a kind of reputational risk there, as well as a legal responsibility. And obviously, if there's an outbreak, then the media are going to be straight onto that. And they won't necessarily shout about the client name, but the thing that will stick in the local area and the mind is the venue of where it happened. Even if it wasn't your fault and all that kind of stuff, the reputational thing, unfortunately, is completely out of your control. So whatever gets said out there, social media, normal media, it's really important that everybody is paying attention to these requirements and these risk assessments. So that's kind of existing legislation. Now, specifically, we do have additional belt and braces that comes under the coronavirus, shorthand, it's called coronavirus legislation. It's got a very long title. I can send you it if you want. But the regulations there specify that a gathering organizer or manager must conduct a risk assessment, and they must take all reasonable measures to limit the risk of transmission, and even more specifically, taking into account any guidance that's been issued by the government. So this is an extra level really of something that does already exist. And again, in every version of legislation, this is there. And therefore, it's now written into our legislation until step 3. We don't have legislation beyond that, but I would imagine that this is going to stay there. Now, the liability of who is the organizer or the manager for me, it's an argument for the pedants to worry about. I think we all have a moral obligation to do this together, which I'll talk about in a second. So the responsibility, who's responsible for doing the risk assessment? The short answer is we all are. This is so new to everybody. The risk that you're introducing to a venue with a big group of people coming to an event is completely different from a risk profile to the risk of a couple who are coming for an overnight stay or even a week or whatever. But because this is people based, the minute the people profile changes, your risk is completely different. It's like saying, well, here's my risk assessment, I've assessed electricity, and actually somebody's fallen down a well that was and say, well, I did a risk assessment, yes, but you've completely ignored a massive great big hazard. So it's a completely different hazard. It needs a separate assessment than your normal leisure guests experience. Okay, so that is something that's really, really important, I think, for this. It's if you just have a good normal guest one that was done back in, July 2020, the science has changed massively since then, but B, you'll have missed tons of opportunities for transmission, and therefore you'll be missing a load of hazards, and you cannot possibly put sufficient measures in place if you haven't identified all the risk. So we do go into that a little bit more in a second, but fundamentally this requirement to produce and carry out a risk assessment means you will need to do a specific one for your gathering, for your event. Now, with all of that in mind, hopefully there's a compelling point for my next section, which is about leading from the top in venues. Well, in any organisation really, but this is such a huge culture shift for us. It's possibly going to need some extra money. It's probably going to need some more people. It may need some restructuring in terms of the business. It might need considerable investment, particularly for venues in terms of the tech that's available to you, ventilation, remodeling areas to make them work better with these kind of things in mind. So there's no benefit to be had if somebody who's fairly at the coalface but doesn't have that sort of responsibility for decision making and budgets is doing this. This does need to be leading from a senior management level. There's also expectation management, both with staff and with clients, to make sure that everybody is, realistic about what can be achieved and understands how it's going to happen. And those conversations are a lot easier if they're led from the top. The other thing is, once the rest of the staff and the rest of the clients see that this stuff's being led from the top, then they're much more likely to kind of go along with it and think, okay, well, I better do it. This is important to our organization. And, you'll make the case to lead by example, and then people will, be more compliant, if you like. The next point, which is sort of similar really, is about starting this process from the very beginning. So what we don't want is for people to be trying to recreate how they used to use their space, or recreate the kind of events that you used to have, and then just trying to add a measure on at the end, if you like. It's not going to be a best guest experience if that's the way you go about it, because you don't get left with much. If you just try and recreate what you used to do, you're left with sort of ugly one-way systems and masks and social distancing, and a lot of the other stuff is too late. But if you're thinking about this really early on, if you're working either with your client or just as a team, before the client picks up the phone, to really reinvent how you use your space, you're going to have a head start and you're going to have an advantage. The other thing is that, really, really just throw everything up in the air and start again with what can we do in terms of hybrid experiences? Is there something that we can offer that's a pre-event experience that works with COVID safe measures? Some of the amazing stuff we've seen coming out of virtual events. The Savoy did this whole thing where they did cocktail making. They sent out elements from the menu. They sent out gifts from the rooms. It was a Savoy branded experience, even though the guests didn't go anywhere near the Savoy. So what can you add to a package that will build and boost engagement, where you may have to have sort of dropped it down for other reasons, for COVID safety reasons somewhere else? So if you start early enough, you can build those kind of things in as a whole, instead of just looking at it as a risk assessment process. So if you're weaving those measures into the whole event, you're building a really good guest experience. Now, there's some extra challenges, I think, really for venues, and specifically the way your space is being built and used. Historically there's bespoke and custom built spaces where you've got a ballroom and you've got a foyer attached, or you've got syndicate rooms and a catering area that links to that. It's probably going to need a really serious rethink if that sort of layout is still going to work. Historically, the registration areas are small, they encourage networking, but they do also kind of push people together. So it's time to sort of go back to the drawing board, really, almost literally, with your venue plans and go, right, what can we do that's going to help with this? And this is keeping people in small groups, keeping people in nice big open spaces, making sure you don't have pinch points in corridors or toilets or those kind of arrival entrances. Can you use different entrances? Now, consult your stakeholders when we're just coming to the end of the planning section. And I have mentioned this a lot because it's really important. We have to do this together. It needs to be a two-way communication process with suppliers, with clients, with staff, with senior teams. We'll get better ideas. If we do it together, we're going to come up with stuff that works a lot better. Instead of the organizer saying to you, right, I want them all to come in that way and I want them to use that area. You know your venue, you make the suggestion to them, let's do this as a team. It also is going to improve compliance. So if you give your client a list of hard and fast rules that are non-negotiable and they have to do, they might decide actually that doesn't work with their risk assessment and they'd rather choose a different venue. But B, they're less likely to reinforce it with their own guests because they don't really believe in what's happening because they haven't been part of the process. So if everybody's part of the process, your compliance is much, much greater. So not only you get better ideas, but you get better compliance. I think in general, the sort of information as an event planner that I would like to see from a venue. So when we start these conversations about, right, let's have a look at our risk assessment. First of all, a COVID secure events policy / framework / approach, however you want to call it, but something that outlines what you've done, what you will do, what's in place. And specifically addresses, I would say, maybe your classic events. So if your venue is used to doing tons and tons of dinners, have a really good think and include a section about suggestions for running dinners. Catering is a huge section, so it's kind of like a menu pack. That's what I'm thinking. So it's a huge amount of work up front, but once it's there, it means that the clients are more likely to use something that's good for you. And it gives everybody a starting point to then have a discussion around, well, we like menu B, but can we move that and change that and add this? So if you've got a starting point of proposals that you can give to your client, it shows your commitment. It shows that you are really doing what you need to do and thinking about this, but it also means they're more likely to take your ideas on board and move with that, as their solution. So if you can do that work up front as a team with all of your relevant stakeholders, and then start that conversation as a starting point with your clients, it's going to be much smoother, it's going to be way more efficient, and it's going to just start the whole thing off on the right foot as a team effort. So that's what I would really like to see as part of this. And hopefully event planners are also coming to you with something similar that says, here's my organization or my client's policy. This is their attitude to risk. These are the measures they are very happy with. These are the things we're trying to avoid. We do talk about this later when I look at risk assessments, but it's a slider. There's certain, if one risk is very high, everything else needs to be brought down very low. And there's no black and white on that. There's no, well, you have to test or you don't have to test, or you have to have all the windows open or you don't have to, everything kind of works on a slider about what's the overall level of risk. So having a black and white, completely fixed policy or completely fixed outcome is not always going to be the best way, because how often is the event the same? How often is the group of people that walk through your doors the same? They're not, are they? So having a fixed set of rules isn't appropriate either. It needs to be built in collaboration. I need to speed up. Okay, so level 0.5, we're now looking at doing our risk assessment. We've had all those amazing conversations. We're really happy that we're cracking on and we're getting to a point where we have an event that's designed to assess. Make sure you're understanding your hazard, you know your enemy. The science is changing. Keep on top of it. Understand how the virus moves, and make sure that everyone in your team understands how the virus moves, because that way this becomes a group effort instead of sitting on one person in an office desperately trying to kind of type out risk assessments. We need everybody to be aware of it, and to be reporting any incidents that they're concerned about, or feeding back about ways they've got to, suggestions to improve things. Particularly at the moment, the science, airborne transmission is a massive risk. It wasn't realised early on. It's a huge risk, particularly for what we do. And in a venue specific section, hopefully we are going to be removing the legal requirement to social distance. We're going to be moving the legal requirement to wear a face covering. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to have to assess the risk, and those things might have to be introduced if the risk is high enough. But if we have removed those things, we're not left with much else to reduce the risk. The biggest thing we are left with is ventilation. Decent ventilation in your venue is going to be huge. This is my prediction. It's already happening. It's already kind of, being a discussion point on social media and LinkedIn, and, with my health and safety colleagues. So I would strongly advise that you get your current ventilation assessed by, a competent person who can measure the quality of air and the airflow in your venue. And if necessary, look to do some refurbishment or changes that will improve that, because it really is going to be a crucial part of our reduction measures when we start to remove all the other restrictions. So that's really important. Keep your eyes on the science and make sure that you're addressing the real risk, instead of being kind of almost misdirected into a huge amount of hand washing and sanitizing, which isn't necessarily our biggest risk in our environment. The biggest risk for us is really airborne and direct, close transmission. So just make sure that you're keeping up to date on that. Now, the other thing that you need to keep really up to date on when it comes to the assessment is the guidance. There is a lot of very detailed guidance from the government and from industry about how we are supposed to do this. It changes very regularly, so you do need to keep your eyes on it, or you can sign up for our mailing list on our website, and we will send you updates when we've noticed something and when we've kind of summarized it for you. So it's all held. I'll just very quickly show you. Hopefully you've all seen this and you're all very, very familiar with this, which is the Working Safely During Coronavirus page. And everything for all different industries is on this website. So they have a separate guidance for hotels and B&B, heritage locations, performing arts. So there's all sorts of different industries that are covered by this. So the case is knowing what you are and reading and understanding the guidance for how you are expected to operate. And the main one for business events is held under the visitor economy. So anything under there is where you'll find specific instructions for business events. This is the guidance that is referenced in the legislation. So if you don't follow a suggestion in this guidance, you have to have a very good reason why and a very good demonstration of what you are doing instead. Specifically for the events industry, the government guidance references 3 industry guidance documents from the MIA, which is very venue focused, very good for conference and meetings. The AEO, which is very venue focused, but for exhibitions, so much bigger events. And the EIF, which is outdoor events, so less relevant for venues, but still very useful for event organisers. There's also guidance on TV and films, but again, that's probably not as relevant for you. It's more an organiser that would need to be following that one for virtual filming. So once you've hit the point where you understand the transmission risk, you're happy that you are applying the guidance, or you at least know where it is and you need to find it. The next step is just to be really methodical. We talked about having those documents planned out ahead of time, where you've kind of imagined a an event in your head, and that's all it is. Just imagine that guest experience, as well as imagining your staff experience. So start from the minute that that event comes in. What happens? When do we start setup? How do we do this? What where are the staff working here? And then once the guests arrive, what does it look like? And work through every single step. A cloakroom is a brilliant example. Cloakrooms historically in venues are tiny little cupboards that are stuck at in a foyer. Is that safe for your staff? Can you operate it with just one member of staff, or is it safe for two people to be in there? They're generally not big enough. So if you've kind of worked through methodically, then at some point your brain goes, right, and the guests come in and they need a cloakroom. Okay, right, think about the cloakroom. So you just go through every single hazard and assess it, and then put in measures to reduce the risk as a whole, rather than just listing a whole load of measures that aren't necessarily relevant to the risk. So that's the main thing there, is to start with the risk, start with the hazard. When can the virus move? What's the transmission? And how can I do proportionate measures to reduce that risk? Very quickly, isolation impact. Hopefully you're already familiar with this if you have opened, because if your chef went off sick or had to isolate, or the GM had to isolate, this should be part of your planning anyway. So if your event op is suddenly unavailable and they've had all that planning and all that build up, what do you do? And is there anything that you can do to reduce the risk? So is it worth allowing people to work from home in the build up, whereas that they might be back in the office, but you say, look, for the week before the event, please go and work from home, because I don't want you to get an isolation notice. But also make sure you've got a plan B, so that someone can step in if you need to. And any specialist suppliers that you've got who might be vulnerable to that, make sure they also have a plan B. Communications are really important to a risk assessment that is largely people-based. We need to make sure we're telling people the rules. We need to make sure we're telling our staff what's happening. Now, the real challenge, I think, that needs a focus for you guys is that, as I've said before, the rules may change depending on the profile of who's coming in and the event and how it's all going to work. There might be a different one-way system. There might be a different rule about you are allowed in that area, you're not allowed in there, you do need to wear a mask in there, you don't need to wear a mask in there. Now, for your staff, particularly agency staff or infrequent members, this could be really confusing. So make sure you've thought really clearly about how you're going to communicate with them. Maybe some rehearsals, maybe some dry runs about it. It kind of depends on exactly what's going on, but just be aware that changing rules will need some real solid comms around them for your team. It's important for mental safety as well, that people know what to expect when they arrive at the venue and what to expect, during the event, and also to know that you're doing everything you can to keep them safe. So make sure you're communicating with your organisers about what's happening behind the scenes, as well as what's happening in the more obvious areas, and over communicate generally. We'd strongly advise publishing risk assessments on your website and directing people to them. You need something as well as that that's more user friendly, so like a one-page briefing sheet or something. But again, this should probably be specific to each event, because the situation is going to be different, and therefore the rules and the measures are going to be different. Finally, technology there's so many options out there, and I'm not the best person to talk about venue technology. I think you guys are probably the best people to talk about venue technology. But a couple of things, scanners, we need to remove touch points. So anything that can scan a person or scan a card instead of needing to push buttons. Auto controlled doors, ventilation, I've already mentioned. But this is a time when any technology that may have been in the future is suddenly much more important. Cliveden have now got Bluetooth door control, so you don't even need keys. And that's the sort of thing that we would imagine venues need to really seriously consider at the moment. So I'm going to finish, because I do want to have a bit of time for questions at the end, but just very briefly, we offer 2 training courses around these subjects. And the first one is quite detailed. It involves a live workshop with me, a half-day workshop, and also an assignment. And that's designed for people who have the responsibility for writing risk assessments. So if you need to carry out your risk assessment, then that course will give you lots of practical experience, group work, and then the assignment. So that's one of the courses. And then the second one is designed for everybody else in the industry, basically. So everybody needs to know this. Everybody needs to understand their role in it, and everybody needs to be aware of what's happening behind the scenes so that they can have confident discussions with people about COVID secure events. So that one is a more executive level summary. It talks around all the relevant points, but it's all online. So you can kind of do that at your own pace. Both courses are updated regularly online, depending on what changes with the guidance. So we issue new modules that you can view at any time, and you have access to your training platform for a year after you buy it. So you can stay up to date for a year after that purchase, and you can buy now, train later. You don't have to complete it. You can just make the commitment to buy and sort it and get it done, but then, you know, actually do the training when it's more convenient for you. Because you've come to this webinar, we are going to give you a discount for those courses. So if you use the code VENWEB, VENWEB 20, that will give you a 20% discount off both of those courses, and it's valid for a week, so until Tuesday, the 6th of April. Another thing that's interesting, just got confirmed yesterday, I'm doing a talk with MySbook and a lawyer next week on Wednesday afternoon, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what can we do, and they've released 99 pages of new legislation, so we're going to work our way through that and the impact that it will have on us for the next few steps as well. So I strongly recommend you put that in your diary if you're free.